Are we streaming?
Not yet.
No, okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this August 5th, 2020 meeting of the North Carolina State Board of Education. I'm Eric Davis, Chair of the Board, and I call this meeting to order. I now welcome board members, advisors, staff, visitors, online listeners, and Twitter followers. For our visitors and those listening online, our committee meetings and reports will span 2 days. Today's meeting will include voting on, tomorrow's meeting, will include voting on any items needing action. This time I'd like to express a special thanks to Deanna and Henrietta for arranging the logistics for us to meet in a socially distant, mask-wearing, hand-sanitized hybrid fashion this month. Thank you for that extra effort. Board members are reminded that it's our duty to avoid conflicts of interest and the appearance of conflicts of interest as we handle the work of this board. Does any member of the board know of any conflict of interest or any appearance of conflict with respect to any matters coming before us at this meeting? If so, please state them for the record. If during the course of the meeting you become aware of an actual or apparent conflict of interest, please bring the matter to the attention of the chair. It will then be your duty to abstain from participating in discussion on the matter and from voting on the matter. The board extends a warm welcome back to school, either under Plan B or C, for those schools or districts that are operating on a year-round schedule.
Mr. Buxton.
Oh, Mr. Buxton.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I request to be recused from EICS 4.
Let the record reflect that Mr. Buxton has recused himself from EICS 4. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Additionally, August 17th marks the arrival for all of our public school students returning from their summer break to more structured instruction, be that remotely to begin the year or returning for in-person instruction part-time based on health and safety measures. While COVID-19 makes this year's school opening unique from any we have experienced so far, we lift up and support those in leadership positions making the necessary and often difficult decisions to do what is in the best interest of their students, teachers, and staff. We commend every Board of Education, superintendent, and principal in leading our schools into a successful school year. An additional challenge we face in our reopening plans is the interruption due to Hurricane Isaias. Many of the same schools and communities that were impacted by this storm are still recovering from hurricanes of the last 2 years. As this storm passes, we commend our first responders and all who are assisting the recovery efforts as we continue to move forward with reopening schools. I'm often asked what can be done to support our students and teachers in reopening our schools. Well, since our schools reflect the health and safety of our communities, the number one thing we can do to support our students and teachers is to commit ourselves to pound this virus out by practicing the 3 W's: washing our hands, waiting 6 feet, and wearing our mask. In doing so, we demonstrate our solidarity with our frontline educators and our care and compassion for all of our students, while we look forward to a vaccine in the near future to enable us to fully return to in-person instruction. Today, we're also delighted to welcome our new teacher advisor to the board, Ms. Maureen Stover. Ms. Stover, we congratulate you on your selection, and we look forward to your comments and advice in the coming year. And tomorrow we'll have a more formal welcome for you, but we want to welcome you this day. Congratulations. Board members, you've seen the agenda for over a week and had the opportunity to review it. A late addition to the agenda at the request of Ms. White is a 4th discussion item for the EICS committee, so please refresh your screen if you do not see that item after we vote for approval. I ask if there are any other requests for changes to the agenda. Hearing none, I request a motion for approval of today's agenda. Motion by Ms. White. Is there a second?
Olivia offers a
Second by
second.
Dr. Oxendine. Dr. Townsend Smith, will you call the roll?
Yes, sir. Mr. Buxton? Mr. Buxton?
Sorry, getting off mute. Can someone repeat the motion again? The sound is cutting in and out. I could not understand it.
Sure, the motion is to approve the agenda.
I'm sorry, I'm not getting the feed.
The motion is to approve the agenda.
Got it, thank you, yes.
Dr. Oxendine?
Yes.
Ms. Chemnitz?
Yes.
Mr. Keenan?
Yes.
Mr. Hall? Mr. Hall?
Yes.
Dr. Tipton Rogers?
Yes.
Ms. White?
Yes.
Mr. Chastain?
Yes.
Mr. Ford?
Yes.
Vice Chair Duncan?
Yes.
Chair Davis?
Yes.
It's unanimous.
Thank you. Today we have a special opportunity to hear from one of our courageous leaders in North Carolina, Dr. Dudley Flood. Dr. Flood, we look forward to your comments and learning from your experiences. At this time, we'll proceed to today's committee reports, and I note to the committee chairs and audience that all voting on consent and any requiring action will be completed tomorrow via roll call vote. We'll begin with our Strategic Planning Committee, led by Mr. James Ford. Mr. Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am James E. Ford, the chair of the Strategic Planning Committee, joined alongside by my vice chair, Ms. Jill Kanmitz. Grateful once again to have the opportunity to present as part of our agenda today, to bring in a distinguished guest. But if I may, in setting up and introducing our speaker for today, just want to appreciate my board members, fellow board members, for their diligence. As we know, as a matter of fact, we adopted our strategic plan last year, August of 2019. We have deliberated much over all of the components, the guiding principles of whole child and of equity, and spent quite a bit of time refining each of the objectives that are contained therein. Our speaker is most appropriate today because I want to acknowledge that as an educator, I have a bias, and that is that I try to anchor everything in history, a true history teacher, because I believe that context is important. You can no more take current events out of context than you can take words out of literary context. And so I want to bring in and acknowledge the present moment that we find ourselves in, even as we do this work of our strategic planning, and recognize that we're part of a longer history. That we find ourselves here not just because it's our duty as a body, but also I think it's somewhat serendipitous, right? When we look at the sort of changing winds that are happening nationally, but we stand on the shoulders of giants in North Carolina, and one of those giants is Dr. Dudley Flood. Even before it was labeled as such, I think the work of equity, of equalizing opportunity for all children in the state has been the life's work of folks like himself and his partner, Dr. Gene Cosby. And so I wanted to bring in Dudley Flood just to really contextualize this moment that we find ourselves in, so that we understand we don't exist in a vacuum, but we exist in a moment, and that individuals have really laid down the tracks for us to be able to move forward. And I really want to give Dr. Flood carte blanche to just help us to safely nestle the work that we're doing in the elongated context and in the history of North Carolina. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to welcome in Dr. Dudley Flood to the microphone to present to us as a state board as we continue to refine our strategic plan, objectives, action framework, and resolution. Dr. Flood?
And members of the State Board of Education, for whom I have great respect. Thank you for the honor that you allow me to use this morning to share with you what no fewer than 7 members on this committee already know, because I've been associated with no fewer than 7 of them through any work I've ever done. And I want to acknowledge that up front. I won't call all of them by name, but they know who they are. And we could have achieved very little had it not been for their help, support, and direction. I'll make some references to the fact that in having looked at both your resolutions, there are some comments I'd like to make regarding those. And prior to that, a couple of comments regarding how we began this journey officially, although we've always been on it, but official beginning. And some of the things we learned in so doing. First, to put this in context, and again, acknowledging that most of you know, but certainly 7 of you know, that we began officially with the State Department's effort in 1969/70 school year. And that effort was largely driven by the federal mandate to desegregate the public schools of North Carolina, but not solely that, because we also had a state mandate to do so. And we worked in conjunction, and the work that my task force and I were able to do, we were juggling ourselves between meeting the responsibilities that the state had been given by federal mandate and by court order and other things, with the idea that we didn't want to rest purely on a legalistic approach, because we knew that if there were to be any change, any substantial change, it would have to become a moral imperative that it do so. Now, that is not to dismiss the fact that federal mandates and the court orders help, and the work of many people who were at local levels advocating helped. But if we had relied purely on being able to say, you gotta do this because the court says so, we would have made very little progress, because there were so many avenues through which one could move, quote, with deliberate speed and still be in federal compliance, but very little change would have taken place. So we learned a few things that were useful. One of those is, excuse me, we had to redefine the concept of ownership of schools. We had to teach that all the schools belong to all the people. Prior to that time, and even to today, you have some of this. The typical person viewed the fact that if he or she had a residence near a school, that they had first priority and a right to attend that school. We were able to help them understand that since all the schools belong to all the people, you have no greater right to school A or school B than anyone else has. The school board has a mandate to assign students. And when the school board does so, the state of North Carolina has a legal provision to provide transportation for any student who is assigned more than a mile and a half from his or her school. And in meeting those, then it turns out that we've tried to provide transportation. We try to get away from slogans like forced busing. There's never been any forced busing in North Carolina. Busing was an opportunity. Busing was a privilege. But if you heard it discussed as forced busing, it would infer that the state was doing something punitive to students. So we spent a good amount of time helping people understand that contradiction of that term was not useful in helping your population to understand why we were doing what we were doing and the way in which we were doing it. We developed a good amount of time developing the concept of equal status relations. We understood then, as we understand now, that while it would be nice if everybody loved each other, that would really be nice, but that's probably pretty impractical. And we really wish nobody hated anybody else, but that's unlikely as well. But we do think it's possible to respect each other. And most of us have never sought specifically to be liked or loved necessarily. We wanted to be respected. And I think that's general for all people. I don't think it has any peculiarity to a demographic. But it is certainly true in the Black community. That struggle has been for respect, respect of capability, respect of having a general sense of pride, respect for wanting a similar kind of life than anyone else would want, and that sort of thing. And so I'm trying to move away from the notion of we are trying to be equal. We were at the notion that we want to have equity. Equity is very decisively different from equality. Equality presupposes that everybody would be on a whatever the level playing field thing is we talk about. But equity would realize that there is no level playing field in America, that the playing field is a determinant of circumstances over which you have no control. Growing up as I did in northeastern North Carolina, I had no real discretion about where I attended school, no real discretion about the offerings. I did have the opportunity to make the best of whatever they were. But even having done so, that was a great differential between what I later learned that others had exposure to and experience, and that to which I'd had exposure and experience. So it begs the question, no matter what modicum of success you had enjoyed, how that might have been magnified and multiplied had you had a different set of opportunities. And so the terms equity began to grow out of the fact that probably the most inequitable thing I know is equality. To treat everybody alike presumes that everybody has the same need and the same avenues to acquire things that meet those needs. And then fourthly or thirdly, we spent a good amount of time providing opportunities for people to know what was available throughout the country and throughout the world. We learned that the great motivator is possibility. And when one knows something to be possible, it's more probable that one would seek to emulate that, if not to replicate it. So we were able to do a fair amount of research to demonstrate what I've come to have as my most overriding conclusion. And that is we can, whenever and wherever we choose, educate any child whose education is of interest to us. Whether we do or not will depend on how we feel about the fact we've not done so already. Because we already know more than we need to know to do that. Now, that was the undergirding principle that we tried to teach, that we tried to help people to understand it isn't a matter of capability, it's a matter of commitment that drives us to want every child to have whatever the best opportunity we can generate for him or her. And then to inculcate through every resource we can within that child the realization that if you follow this opportunity and maximize it, there are very few limitations that you'll encounter later in life. And then the final thrust we had was to reduce the discontinuity between home and school. We found that the discontinuity was creating an inequity within itself. That is to say that many of the parents who had not had the best experience while in school had a poor feeling about what school might offer their children. And sometimes they were less than anxious to have the child have the attitude that one must take to school if one is to be most successful. So we found a fair number of students coming to school with a failure avoidance attitude as opposed to a success attitude. We learned there's a great difference between success, striving for success, and striving to avoid failure. If one has been inculcated to believe that he or she is inherently unequal and inherently less capable, then one is more inclined to strive to failure avoidance. We don't want to get it wrong. And if you spend a lot of your energy in trying to not get it wrong, then you waste energy that you ought to be spending in trying to improve it and get it better. So those are areas in which generally we spend our time. Not limited to that, but among those, and those with higher priorities that we found that really would work if we were to continue to apply them. Now, if I may say a word about the resolutions. First of all, to commend you for having fortitude to persist over these years to continue to strive at something that has been slow to catch on. And although it's caught on in some quarters better than others, but I was so impressed in reading your resolutions. And I've extracted just 2 or 3 points from that I'd share with you and embellish. First of all, the resolution to support equity in education is in and of itself a generator of enthusiasm and a belief in the fact that some important body believes that this is worth doing. State Board of Education is more of an important body than sometimes it may realize. When I was a classroom teacher, just the mention of the State Board of Education was exciting. I'd never seen it, knew it existed, but just the mention of it. When my principal would say the State Board says, I took that for fact because I viewed that as a body, first of all, that was included people who had more knowledge than I could possibly have about any subject having to do with education, who had studied it in greater depth than I was able to do, and who had determined that to be good for the state of North Carolina. And so the fact that this Board of Education has considered endorsing such a resolution and bringing weight to it, just that fact alone drives the thinking in a different direction. And it allows there to be something which to quote when one is trying to defend the concept, because they can start with saying the State Board says, the State Board has resolved. So that alone is very inviting. But then I want to call attention to whereas number 4, which clearly answers the question of why this is the right thing to do. It is enumerated so clearly in whereas 4 that it would be unusual for anybody not to get it, to not understand why we're putting this energy and this emphasis on supporting equity in education. And then whereas 7 refers to the research that supports what we're doing. That gives credibility to the fact that this wasn't just somebody's overnight dream, but it can be backed up by the fact that we've seen this happen. That was research in the 80s and 70s that demonstrated all that we need to know that this is a critical matter. And sometimes that research has gotten buried. And here in North Carolina alone, we were privileged to do in 1985 a piece of research which was funded by the state of North Carolina and established by the State Board of Education, which we call Time on Task. And we simplified that, called it Time for Learning. And some of you will recall that that was done in 3 counties in North Carolina. One was Polk County, one was Halifax County, and the third was to have been Hope County, but Hope later wasn't able to carry it through, so we stuck with Polk. And we learned some things that were very useful, which we didn't act on. And so while the research was there to demonstrate that when we went to those counties and asked them to do a 6-hour day rather than a 5-hour day, and they did, we asked them to do a 10-month calendar rather than a 9-month calendar, which they did. And we enhanced their capability by saying to the teachers, you will get a 5% increase over what you would normally get, not to mention the fact that you'll have another month to be paid, because back in those days you were only paid for 9 months. And that the test scores just flew out of the top. We did that for 3 years. We documented it, but the cost weighed it down and we didn't move on it. So to bring that to attention of people, that we do have research that demonstrates there are ways that we can increase equity in our state. And we don't necessarily have to look anywhere but what we've already done. And then finally, I would add that in the resolution that I saw several things in, but to save your time, I'll only mention one. The strength of having designated a plan through which you made reference to the fact that you would encourage the State Department to have a person who is put in charge. We've learned that if there is to be change in a significant and continuing way, there has to be some respected, committed person whose name becomes synonymous with whatever that change is to be. And he or she has to become that change. They have to epitomize it. They have to live it. When they're eating lunch, somebody can come to them and ask about that change, and they are in position to answer that, and they don't feel that it's having been put upon or disenfranchised from having the right to be off. You aren't off in this business. You're never off in it. I've been retired since 1996, and I haven't had a day off yet. My phone is likely to ring before I finish this conversation with you, with somebody wanting to know how can we do this better. So you're not going to do it quickly. It has to be a continuing process, and there has to be some identification that says this is important enough that we've put somebody who we hold responsible for having it done. Now I will stop there because I was told that I should take 12 to 15 minutes, and I've about done that. But if there's any specific question to which you would like to have further embellishment, I'd be very available to do that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Ford.
Dr. Flood, let me express that it's an extreme pleasure to hear your words. And to my fellow board members, please take whatever opportunity, please take this opportunity to ask Dr. Flood whatever questions you may have. I appreciate that he has been retired since 1997. But as you can see, the work still continues, and he's made himself available and thought it not robbery to come before us and speak. And so I'll open the floor to any questions that we might have for Dr. Flood regarding his thoughts on our continued efforts for the strategic plan and to embody the guiding principle of equity.
Mr. Ford, this is Olivia.
Dr. Oxendine.
Thank you, Mr. Ford. And Dr. Flood, it just gives me such a warm feeling to be hearing your voice. I was one of those, you may not remember me, but I was one of those back in the last 25, 30 years who want to think that I had some effect on Indian education in North Carolina with one person you'll remember, Betty Mangum. And as a matter of fact, I just sent her a text message to let her know that we had a distinguished speaker before the state board, Dr. Dudley Flood. So I expect a quick text from her as soon as she has a minute to look at her phone. I would like to, it has been such a sweet sentimental journey, listening to you. I'd like for you, if you could take a minute, and I don't know anyone in North Carolina who has the perspective that you have, if you would take a minute and talk about where we've come since 1970, 69, 70. That was the first year I began teaching in an all-white system here in Robeson County. So if you could do that, I would certainly appreciate you doing so.
Thank you, Dr. Oxendine, and I most certainly remember you and your work, and you will recall that I spent a fair amount of time in and out of your unit during the time when you were a brand new teacher. In 1970, we were dealing with a very different set of circumstances than we now deal with because, as most of you are aware, there had been several efforts to slow the move toward the desegregation of schools. You'll remember that the impetus came from Brown 1, which said that we have determined these schools to be inherently unequal, which we knew. But then Brown 2, in which there was a move for further relief, said we must move with deliberate speed to remove the dual school system and to remove the vestiges thereof. Now, the dual system in North Carolina was dismantled with deliberate speed. Good deal more deliberation than speed, because early on the state board did something which slowed the process, and that is, it remanded back to the local units the responsibility of desegregation. Up to that point, state board had been fairly authoritarian, and it remanded it back to the local units, which means at that time we had 152 local school systems. And that meant that whatever was to be done would be done individually to those school systems or with them. So those of us who were offering technical assistance were spread fairly thinly, as you might imagine. Be it only that we worked by request, we didn't go anywhere unless we were asked to come. But that 152 school systems were a great lot. Now, a third of those school systems went ahead and did what we call 441 integration. That is, that they initiated the process on their own with no specific direction from any of us. We were still the intermediary with the federal government, but did not necessarily have a hand in what they did. Another third were under court order, and another third were under the jurisdiction of what was then the Office of Civil Rights, that was under the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And in each of these instances, we were offering technical assistance if you needed it and requested it on how to do that without any more duress than you had to have. Those school systems that were small had less problem because many of them, for example, there were school systems in North Carolina that had only 2 schools. Several had only 3 schools. So they simply took one of those schools and made it a high school, took the other one and made it 1 through 8, and they were fully in compliance. There had been about 5 or 6 of those at that time. Then there were others that had a few more than that, 4 or 5 systems, and they didn't have that much difficulty in making the transition, except there were people who did not want to leave their school because their grandparents had finished that school. And even if the roof was falling in, they still wanted to be in that building. So we had to negotiate that and help people to understand the criticality of trying to learn with water dropping in a bucket through the roof. But we were able to achieve that. Now, the places where we had the greatest difficulty were the larger places where any mode of desegregation would require movement of a massive number of young people. And those were the 5 or 6 major metropolitan areas. So they took more time, they put more effort. But ultimately, the results was that by 1973, all of the school systems in North Carolina were in compliance with federal guidelines having to do with desegregation. But they hadn't done as much as one might desire about removing the vestiges. And that's where we still are, and that's where your resolutions speak to. Those vestiges are still rampant. They're still evident, but the focus has moved away from them in the years since that, except for a few committed and dedicated people who have maintained that focus. And so in your resolutions, you have revitalized that focus. And you've called attention to the fact, without being punitive, that there is a need to rectify that. There's a need to study again those vestiges that were the result of having been separate and unequal for so many years. And so around 1975 or 76, the focus which we had generated by federal funds left us and went north, because they realized that northern units hadn't done any more desegregation than we had. They didn't have the legal mandate that we have, so they were doing. They were out of compliance by de facto. We were out of compliance by de jure, which is much easier to address because all you got to do is get the laws to be met. De facto, you have to change the hearts, and that's where you are now. And that is what your thrust is to be, to get people to think differently. If everybody begins to recognize the eleemosynary nature of education, public education, to realize it's not designed for the individual, it's designed for the good of the whole, and that to waste some talent by undereducating it is a fallacy which neither of us ought to want for ourselves. I have no children, but I work really hard to see that my neighbors' children are well educated. Very important to me that they have an education. And I'm online right now. I'll call you back. It's very difficult for me to ignore the fact that I'm not going to be much better off than the less well-off person who is around me. And so your thrust is much more sophisticated, much more indefinitive as to how you get it done, and require a deeper strategy than we were able to employ back then. But thank you for the question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Ford? Mr. Ford?
Yes. Two.
Yes. This is Mr. Mr. King.
Oh, okay. Mr. Keenan, please proceed.
Okay. Mr. Keenan. I'd like to take a moment of pleasure to thank you, Dr. Floyd, Dr. Flood, for all the things you've done for the children of North Carolina for the many, many years. I've known you for a long time. One of the biggest things that I deal with daily now is when I hear some of the issues that we deal with in the Black community, that some of the things that you talked about today are some of the same things you have talked about when I first met you. It's sort of give me anguish sometimes when I hear that we're still dealing with issues when it comes to our children that was back in the 60s, saying like I heard Dr. Martin Luther King, a lot of his speeches, and the same thing he talked about back then, we're still dealing with in 2020. It breaks my heart to realize that we have to sometimes enact laws or policies or resolutions to get people to do what is right. And as you said, it's only doing what is right and caring for other people. And I strongly believe until we can change the heart, you can put things on paper, you can put things on internet, but until that heart is changed to care for your mankind, you will continue to talk about equity. And I think you alluded to that earlier, how you care for your neighbors' children or whatever. And I think that's the mindset we got to believe, that as while we continue to pass laws and resolutions, let's continue to change our hearts to do what God wants us to do. And thank you, Dr. Flood, for everything you do for us.
Thank you for all the work you've done in and around your county, and even from here, we've sent people to see you when they were looking for a good person to talk with.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, did I hear?
Yes,
another speaker?
When they're all.
Mr. Hall, please proceed.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Flood, I must say that I don't have a question. I just have a comment, if I can. I can say to you and to others, your words today ring as true as they did in 1970. When I was fortunate enough and had the opportunity to work under you at the State Department of Public Instruction. And I thank you so much for your vision, for your committed vision. For you have not changed or swayed not one bit. Even though time takes its advantage of our looks sometimes, but the brain and the wit and the sincerity, Dr. Flood, is still there. And I thank you, sir, for all that you've done for this state, and as a personal black male, the leadership you provided for me during 1970. And you know those were some rough days with some of us. Thank you, sir. I appreciate you. I love you. And think of the world of you. Thank you, sir.
And let me personally thank you for all that you have done for my hometown and my home community, and that you continue to do for them. And don't you think for 1 minute that we don't know it and recognize it. I appreciate you and appreciate your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Doc.
Mr. Ford, J. Bailey.
Mr. Buxton, please proceed.
Thank you, sir, and Dr. Flood, thank you for joining us. I want to say to my members that I've always felt like anchoring. I'm getting a little feedback here. I'm trying to wait it out.
I think it should be good now.
Like the anchoring narrative of the Department of Public Instruction, Dr. Flood and Dr. Cosby did, Dr. Phillips, to ensure that our effort at school integration went the way it did for all students. And I felt like it expressed the values of our educational leadership in the state in the direction we were going to move public education in the state of North Carolina. And it's one of the great stories, I think, education stories and social justice stories of the 20th century in North Carolina. And I say that without any attempt at hyperbole. I think it's that important. And so, Dr. Flood, when I hear your statements about the importance of our voice in the equity conversation, it speaks volumes. And when you talked earlier about the commitment that drives us to want the best opportunity for every child, to put the resources in place to make that happen, that's what I wrote down, what you just said. And then your admonition that the schools belong to everyone. We all have a responsibility to make all of our schools what they need to be. I feel like the equity resolution has been constructed by the board members who have been working on this in that fashion and with those values in mind. So not a question here, but Mr. Ford, I just wanted to express my support and the degree to which Dr. Flood's experience, I think, calls us to a leadership moment, but also just want to express that I feel honored to have Dr. Flood join us, given the considerable weight he has in our state's history. Thank you.
I'll give Dr. Flood a chance to respond if you like, and then after that, we'll go to Mr. Bristow Smith.
I just want to say I don't know anybody who has a great understanding of what we need and what we've done, and who has joined in that effort and clarified it more than J.B. Brooks. So thank you so much, J.B. I appreciate those comments.
Mr. Bristow Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Ford, and thank you, Dr. Flood, for those powerful words of wisdom and insight that have provided us a historical context on this moment as we're reflecting upon the power of equity in the work that we do. I am a public school educator from Edgecombe County, North Carolina, in the eastern part of our state. We are a Tier 1 county. We are in the bottom 40 in terms of economic prosperity in North Carolina. And so the work that we have done here and continue to do is equity work. I wanted to ask Dr. Flood if you could comment upon the importance of the state board's leadership in providing language and a framework for action as it relates to the equity work of superintendents across our state, of the leadership within their LEAs, and the work of building level principals. Could you speak to the reason that it's so critical that the state board leads with an equity framework for every LEA in our state? I would appreciate hearing your remarks with that. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for that question. The criticality is don't underestimate the impact that a local superintendent uses from the state board's disposition on a matter. This is not be critical, it's an analytical thing. That when we were working years ago, there were superintendents who would say to us, I'm gonna have you come and talk to my board, but please understand, I will sit on one side of the room and you will sit on the other. Because what they needed from us was the reinforcement of the fact that this wasn't just the superintendent's knee-jerk reaction to something, that there was an impact that the state of North Carolina had determined that we need to be pursuing a certain direction. And then we were still friends. It wasn't that we were adversarial, but they needed the impact so that they could go to their local constituency, who were not as far along in the thinking as they were, and you know, in effect say, this isn't something I just threw on you. This is real. This is something that the state has pondered and has concluded that is in the best interest of education for the state. Now, when the state board does this, when the state board says this, it gives us a paradigm. We don't have to create anymore a paradigm. We have one. And here's how now we can embellish it. We can modify it to suit our individual predilection, our individual need. But we always have something at our back, so to speak, that reinforces the fact that this is worth doing. You will be asked as a local superintendent, you'll be asked as a local principal, where'd you get this from? Who did it? How do you know it will work? Or is this somebody telling us what we have to do? And they have to be prepared to understand how to address those issues. And that isn't going to be taught in the graduate school. I've taught in the graduate school at 3 universities. We didn't teach that in either one of them because that's not in the curriculum. So you have to have somebody who would take the time, as James Ford has done and others, to sit down with somebody and say, when that arises, this is how you address it. Specifically to somebody who is at a crossroads about how to handle that. And then there must be a development of research that is available to say, read the Pygmalion Studies, which I've used 100 times. In the Pygmalion Studies, they demonstrated the value of expectations that you have of students. They specifically showed, Dr. Rosenthal took some students and put them in groups into the lower one group, and the teachers, he said, these are not so good students. And to the second group, he said, these are average. And to the third group, he said, these are bright students. They were selected at random. And they studied their progress. And do you know what happened? Those who had been told and had come to believe that they were slow had behaved in that fashion. And those who had been told they were average had behaved in that fashion. And those who had been told they were superior and excellent had behaved in that fashion. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so those are not things that the pedestrian person walks across the street and learns. Somebody has to teach that to them. And that is why when the state board views this, it has an opportunity to revisit what is needed periodically, to refurbish, to reinvest, and to stay current. And so I don't know any more impactful body there could possibly be than the State Board of Education on what happens in equity in public education. Just the mere recognition of the fact that children are not what you think they are. They're not what they think they are, but they tend to become what they think we think they are. They tend to become that. So if you're in Edgecombe County and all you've ever heard is nobody from Edgecombe County ever did da-da-da-da-da, why would you think you would? Why would you think that? But if you're from Edgecombe County and you heard and saw what wonderful things Edgecombe County had contributed to the rest of the state of North Carolina, you might say, you know, maybe I can add to that. So you get away from the failure avoidance syndrome toward the trying to succeed syndrome. So the state board is going to make that impact. If you did nothing but have the resolutions and burnish them widely, you will have made a contribution, but the follow-up is greater. Follow-up of having somebody to deliver that. Somebody is, because you'll find one person's not enough, but you start where you have to. You'll find the new language that you're asking will come in from the study of those persons who will be working to try to further this concept.
Board members, I am mindful of the hour, but I do want to make sure that we do have the opportunity to ask Dr. Flood any questions. So if there is one or burning question before we proceed, you can take this moment to offer it. But I do want to make sure that we have that we execute our agenda.
Mr. Ford, this is
Yes.
Tony Jackson.
Absolutely, Dr. Jackson, please proceed.
Good morning, and I don't want to belabor the hour, but I could not allow this moment to pass without one, paying homage and honor to a man that I've called my mentor since the day I entered this profession. In August of 1988, he was the convocation speaker in Wake County as I sat as a brand new teacher at the McKimmon Center. And he said at that moment that different is not deficient, it's just different. And that has resonated with me for many years as I've done my work. I would ask a very, very simple question. COVID-19 has exposed, I think, a lot of significant equity issues for us statewide. And I would just say, how do we seize this moment as an opportunity to advance the conversations around equity, challenge structural and institutional barriers that we have built that have prevented us from making the progress? You so eloquently shared the Ron Edmonds quote around, we know what to do. How do we exercise the courage, and what immediate things can we do at the local level to begin to exercise and to actuate the resolution that will come from this board later? Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, my friend. And let me encourage you to know that we've already begun that. There will be students who, like me, had nothing to do with some of the technology that they'll be using as a regular thing within 3 months. It'll be a part of their nature. I didn't know there was a Zoom until we had this pandemic. I didn't have any reason to know that. Now I haven't passed the day except Sunday being on it. And that's growth that I would not have had the privilege of having had I been able to go out. I would have been downtown in the board meeting this morning were it not for this pandemic. Well, while that's not a good thing in and of itself, the chance is likely that we're going to have more people to experience a greater amount of exposure similar to that which others are, because that will be made available to them. I know right here in Wake County now, with several of the organizations of which I'm a part, making provisions to ensure that every student has access. Now that's different. In some of the places you've been, broadband might not have been available in some of those and some of the rest, but that means that North Carolina will be brought to understand that and to understand the criticality of it, because if they've never been dependent upon it, they haven't had to do anything about it. Now we are dependent upon some of those measures. We're also going to learn a delivery system that we never thought possible, and some of us thought it possible, not effective. And we're going to learn how to effect that. And in so doing, not all, but we're going to make more young people have availability to the same kind of things that others have had for years that that we've ever had a chance to do. So while I wish we didn't have to do it this way, I'm encouraged to believe now that we're going to take advantage of this situation. And I'm not optimistic as some. I don't think we'll be through with it in November. I think we'll have it for a while, and manifestations of it are going to carry beyond that. And if we learn something that is very good and useful, we may institutionalize that, whatever it is that comes from this. So I think having shown a light on those inequities, which nobody can miss now, and having had decision makers have to account more broadly and more publicly for the existence of those inequities, that is how change starts. So I'm encouraged. Please don't understand me to endorse this pandemic. I pray every day for it to end, but it's having been here has provided an opportunity for us to assess ourselves in a way that we hadn't done for quite a while. So there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And thank you so much for this time, Chairman Ford and Chairman Davis. You've been more than generous with your time, and I'm so thankful to you that you allow me this honor to spend this time with you. And is there anything I can do at any time to help in your impetus toward what your objectives are, please feel free to call on me.
Dr. Flood, I can assure you that the honor and the privilege is ours. On behalf of my fellow board members, we are blessed and privileged to have had this time with you. You are a luminary. The respect from my colleagues towards you is obvious, and it's clear that you embody all the qualities of a consummate educator, and that so many have very impressionable memories of you and the impact that you've had on their life. And we thank you for the impact that you've had on us in our pursuit of this work here. Thank you again for your time. Board members, that was an extreme treat. I do want to move us through the second part of our agenda for today as part of the Strategic Planning Committee report, and that is to discuss our strategic plan action framework and our resolution. You all may recall, of course, just in summary, as mentioned, that we adopted the strategic plan and approved it last August. We have since then been tasked with building out an action framework. And even, I recall fondly and have been grateful for the learning journey we've engaged with each other. Think back to the retreat that we had on North Carolina Central University's campus, when we were treated to a groundwater presentation by the Racial Equity Institute, which sort of situated our work in the larger systemic context and all the disparities amongst subgroups that were apparent there, even beyond education. Thankful for the numerous speakers and presentations we've seen. We've consulted the data and been relying upon the data, which has allowed us to adopt goals like Goal 1, to eliminate opportunity gaps. That language has been deliberate because it recognizes, as Dr. Flood has alluded to in his comments, that these are really not gaps in achievement as much as they are opportunity, and that they are not reflection of the aptitude of our students, but rather the lack of systemic access that they have. And relying upon that data, helping us to refine and set some metrics in place. As a result of that, we met with stakeholders, many of whom are practitioners, parents, et cetera, who have provided for us valuable feedback on the action framework, which is the way to operationalize and make actionable many of the goals and objectives that we have identified. And of course, you all have had the opportunity now, and as Dr. Flood has spoken to, we also have endeavored to adopt a equity resolution, having already adopted a whole child resolution as well, both of those being the guiding principles of our strategic plan. And so I just want to offer us an opportunity, if we so choose, to have some discussion around these items, to ask whatever questions. Many of you all have already been engaging thoroughly in that process, but again, wanting to do our due diligence, so that we all can have something we feel good about, to have some more discussion about both the action framework and the equity resolution. And you know, and if you have any questions, and actually, Dr. Townsend-Smith, if you feel so inclined to chime in or answer any questions or feel the need to speak, I want to afford you that opportunity as well. But wanting us to take advantage of that at this moment.
Mr. Ford, this is Olivia again.
Yes, Dr. Oxendine.
Thank you. And my question is one of process more than anything else. I have taken a look at the action framework and the resolution. I probably paid, well, I gave some feedback on the action framework and provided it to Ms. Kamnitz. We had a conversation maybe last week, and I'd like to know, will there be an opportunity to make some revisions in the framework and the resolution?
Yes, ma'am, Dr. Oxendine. This would be the time, right, presently, to offer whatever comments you have, and it is our intention to take whatever feedback, to consider it, to incorporate it, and to hopefully, to be able to produce something before you that we could approve, perhaps next month.
Okay, that's good. Just as long as we do have a chance. I don't want to prolong our work this morning to go into the particulars, but I do have some questions that I know when I sent it back to Jill, she probably thought this looks like a professor took charge of this, because I had a lot of notes in the margin. So if we could work out a way to get together and answer some of the questions between now and adoption day, would be really good.
Yeah, well, speaking for myself, and I'm certain Ms. Kamnitz, I know that we're more than open to, making available that time. Of course, we are charged with, acting on this work, but we have the space and availability, and I think it's necessary and prudent to make sure that we hear from our fellow board members, so that we all can feel confident about what ultimately ends up getting approved in September.
Absolutely, because there are terms and ideas that I just needed clarification about. So that's the reason I made some comments and sent them forward. So I suppose Chairman Davis will have a way, and you and Jill, to get us back together either via remote or some way, some mechanism to clarify thoughts and ideas, and
Sure.
would be very helpful.
If that space feels more comfortable than this space, then absolutely. Certainly, if there's any particular items you want me to consider right now or to flag for us right now, I want you to feel free to take that opportunity. And if a later date is more preferable, that's fine as well. And I would say the same for the fellow other board members as well. Any thoughts or reactions you have, we're making this space available right now, but I know we remain open to having further discussion and deliberation.
Thank you.
If I might, this is Ms. Kamnitz. I'd like to just second what Mr. Ford just said. We've been engaged in conversations about this over the last several months. We've been working hard on listening to each other and working on this very important document. I think Dr. Flood just reminded us all the power of the moment that we have right here as a state board to take this action. So to Dr. Oxendine and my fellow board members, I look forward to continuing these conversations in whatever way works for everyone, to make sure that we're listening and respecting each other, as Dr. Flood would say.
Board members, any other thoughts or questions regarding the action framework or the resolution that you would like to lift at this moment in time?
Mr. Ford, JB,
Mr. Buxton, please proceed.
I just wanted to reflect that they feel consistent with the commitments we've made as part of the Leandro conversation as well, and in response to some directives from the court. So I don't see anything in here that's in conflict. I see things that are consistent with and help us carry out those commitments we've made across the 7 elements that are laid out by the court and in our work as part of the case. So I feel like this is all aligning and pushing us in a common direction in support of students. So I appreciate the work of the committee on this.
Yes, sir. And just for refresh the memories of some of our listeners, we have pulled out the specific items within the proposed action framework that align most with Leandro, and we've given those priority. And so we tried to be deliberate, tried to be as deliberate as possible of spelling out the areas where there's overlap and creating a sense of urgency around those Leandro compliant actions.
Mr. Ford, this is Donna Tipton-Rogers.
Dr. Tipton Rogers, please proceed.
I would just like to say I spent quite some time looking and reviewing the strategic plan and the action framework, plus the resolution. And I think you did a wonderful job with the committee work that's been put into this. I feel very fortunate that I have members of the board working on things like this, like you and Ms. Kamnitz. So thank you for your time and effort. And again, it's great work.
Thank you so much for those words, Dr. Tipton Rogers. On behalf of the Strategic Planning Committee, I know that we appreciate it. Mr. Chair, having exhausted all my time, I would return the floor to you so we could proceed with the remainder of our agenda for the day.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ford and Ms. Kamnitz, for your leadership on this work. So one of the strengths of this team is the diversity of our life experiences. And each of us come to this work, just like our constituents, with a wide range of experiences that have shaped us. And it's important for us to take the time to learn from each other and to benefit from the diversity of life experiences that we bring. And so I'm grateful for the feedback that my colleagues have shared thus far and encourage you to do more. These are difficult subjects to discuss. We must become a bit vulnerable in order to be open to speak and listen. And we will create whatever mechanism is supportive of the board's work in continuing to refine and improve and strengthen these statements to represent the board's opinion prior to bringing forward for consideration in September. So thank you again, Ms. Kamnitz and Mr. Ford, for your leadership as you continue to gather feedback, update and refine and improve this important work. At this time, we're going to take a 10-minute break to give our staff an opportunity to make a few tweaks to make our meeting more efficient. And so we will return at 11:20. Say 11:20.